In war, it is said, truth is the first casualty. And generals and journalists have certainly been uneasy bedfellows since conflict was first reported.
These guys are not there to help us. These guys are not there to assist us in eliciting the truth. They are there to inhibit our reporting.
At this point, all coalition land units are conducting humanitarian assistance.
There's a useful tension that exists between those who seek information and those who have information. And that's really what we see in play here.
The Pentagon in the first Iraq War acted with an arrogance that is absolutely foreign to the American system.
In this program, we look at how patriotism, national interest, and security affect the way stories are brought back from the front. When a nation goes to war, the media and the military often fight each other over access, censorship, and ultimately, the truth.
I've become very, very skeptical about the behavior of governments in wars, that because the stakes for them are so high, they can very seldom resist the temptation to tell lies.
Usually, censorship is to protect the rear ends of our own people. That's what it's for. I mean, censorship is 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100 ridiculous.
From my view, I think a sophisticated 21st century view of how broadcast media especially is relevant to war is to recognize that it is also a conduit for communicating information to adversaries, to other governments, to other citizens of countries that have interest in what we're doing, whether it's adversarial interests or friendly interests, and certainly our own population.
It is a known residence that is used by Saddam Hussein and his sons.
The war over control of information is nothing new. In World War II, an American censor reportedly said, "I'd tell the bastards nothing until the war's over, and then I'd tell them who won." So just where does the truth fit when a free and democratic society goes to war? When the decision is made to go to war, governments appeal to the patriotism of their citizens to bolster support for conflict. But for the media, what part does patriotism have to play in reporting a war?
Well, frankly, and it's the brash answer, if you please, none.
I regard myself as a patriotic Englishman, patriotic Brit. I want to see Britain shine in the world, but I don't want to see it shine by bad means. I don't want to cover up its failures. I want to see those failures properly brought out and punished, because that's the kind of country I would like to live in, a country which is honest about itself, which tries its best to behave well, and when it doesn't, it takes the necessary action.
This is it, proof positive that Osama bin Laden was making weapons, chemical weapons. You look at this stuff, you just want to say, that son of a bitch.
Something very scary is going on as well, which is that some parts of the media these days don't necessarily subscribe to the view that they should be producing an impartial piece of journalism. They believe that partial journalism is the way for them. They believe that, if you like, xenophobic journalism, jingoistic journalism, flag-waving journalism is the journalism for them.
For all this criticism, flag-waving journalism proved a big success for one broadcaster in the recent Gulf War. Fox News led US television cable news ratings for the first time ever with its unashamedly pro-American coverage.
I'm ambivalent about patriotism. I'm a proud American. I like my country. But Americans are a little more patriotic than is absolutely necessary. And I don't want to see the war over. I 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 want to It has been an interesting force in world history.
Throughout history, patriotism and loyalty to the government of the day have often been confused. But when the Allies fought Hitler in World War II, few who reported this war on the Allied side doubted the justice of the cause.
The new minister promises the gentlemen of the press that he intends making the ministry into a real news distributing body. That's a bit of good news in itself.
The Allies, and particularly the British, maintained rigorous censorship throughout the war. But some American officers conspired with reporters to get around official censorship.
I can't imagine this happening now, but the colonel in charge of the 8th Air Force Public Relations would call each one of us. When he found out there was going to be a raid the next day on Germany, he would call each one of us and give some heavy-handed code word saying there's going to be a mail delivery tomorrow, as if anybody listening wouldn't have known what he meant. Can you imagine that happening today? My gosh, some of the Pentagon people have a hard time telling you that they've had a bombing right after it's over.
Here are the first pictures of the opening of the second front. Pictures which security demands should be meager at this stage.
At first, British journalists didn't experience the kind of freedom their American colleagues enjoyed. But when General Eisenhower became Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in preparation for D-Day, he commanded all his officers, British and American, to give reporters the greatest possible latitude in the gathering of news. He ordered that reporters should be allowed to talk freely with officers and enlisted men and to see the machinery of war in operation.
I worked for the Army newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, during World War II. And General Dwight Eisenhower is a hero of mine because he made sure we were absolutely free of interference from anybody beneath him, generals on down. Everybody wanted to influence what was in our paper about their unit or units. And he gave us absolutely carte blanche to write as we felt the truth was. And no, we were under no pressure whatsoever. And it was a wonderful thing. It was the best thing that Eisenhower did. Patton tried to influence the Stars and Stripes. He didn't like Bill Mauldin's cartoons because Mauldin poked fun at him, and he tried to get the newspaper banned from Patton's Third Army. Eisenhower says, "Please, George, back off."
Good morning, Vietnam.
Officially, it was not a war at all, as the United States never actually declared war on North Vietnam. As a result, the Pentagon had no constitutional right to impose censorship on reporters. What's more, the first and toughest of the reporters' battles, the battle for access, was resolved very early on by a happy coincidence.
Back in '62, they were trying to keep us off helicopters and whatever, and then a friend of mine came over, Ivan Slavich, who was the commander of the 1st Armed Helicopter Squadron in Vietnam, and company, I guess you call it, and his orders from the Pentagon, from the Army, was to sell the idea of Army aviation, the importance of helicopters. So his job, among other things, was to be very friendly with reporters, and so we got great access. We got into every battle there was. So that took care of access.
It began this morning at a place called Bin Hoa. We decided to join a demolition team that were going out into the field.
It was not hard to work in Vietnam at all, and it was certainly not hard to work with the U.S. military. They were as cooperative as you could imagine to a young television correspondent like myself showing up. They would take me anywhere in the country they wanted to go. They were more than happy to let you stay with units, and the relationship between correspondents and units in the field was really very good. So the coverage of Vietnam was, as they sometimes say in sports, very much up close and personal.
Hey, Joe, where you going with that gun in your hand? Hey, Joe, I said, where you going with that gun in your hand? Shoot my old lady. You know, I'm not to mess around with another man.
Virtually from the beginning and throughout the American involvement in Vietnam, the reporters found themselves bogged down in the middle of another war, the fight between the soldiers on the ground and the top brass in Saigon and Washington.
I thought it would be a great story. I would go and cover this confrontation. It turned out I was going to cover a dual confrontation. I was going to cover the confrontation between the ARVN with the American advisors versus the Viet Cong, and then I was going to cover a confrontation between those Americans in the military who were trying to tell the truth rather pessimistically, and their superiors, which was described as a press struggle, which it was not. It was a struggle within the military, those in the field versus those in Saigon.
Charlie is out there. If and or when we get hit, all I want to hear is hitting back.
Stop! What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
In the mid-60s, the reporters in Vietnam were very much divided as the American people were divided. There were hawks and there were doves. In every network, too. There were guys who thought the war was a good idea and were going out and doing what we'd call gung-ho pieces about what our boys are doing in Vietnam. And then you had guys who were very sensitive to the suffering and dubious about the political aims, who were anti-war reporters. And it was to the point that they looked different, they dressed different. I'm talking about the reporters. They stayed in different hotels, they hung out in different bars. There were two press corps. One was pro-war, one was anti-war.
When the anti-war reporters said or wrote what the politicians and the senior generals didn't want to hear, those in power would sometimes turn their venom on the messenger.
I was very close to being expelled all the time. I was pushing the limits of what a journalist for an American daily newspaper could get away with at that time in the early 60s, about as far as I could. I mean, not just in terms of almost being expelled from the country, but making my bosses in New York a little uneasy with the degree of pessimism and the degree of anger that I was creating in Washington, culminating finally with the President of the United States asking the publisher to pull me out of there, and then subsequently his successor, Lyndon Johnson, taking time from his many, many other difficult obligations to be Minister of Truth and Patriotism and to refer to Neil Sheehan and me, my young colleague, as traitors to our country. And they really set out to destroy my career. There were systematic attacks on my patriotism, my person, my manhood, and it was a real assault to undermine who you were. The idea that I would have come from a left-wing family, they started checking out about my family background. But it was really ugly and it was relentless.
The Pentagon had allowed reporters total access to the front, but they still wanted to put their own spin on the quagmire of their involvement in Vietnam if they could. So they conducted optimistic press briefings every evening in Saigon.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have no additions to today's communique. Are there any questions?
Give us any more than we got yesterday, which was nothing, you know, on targets, results, or any other aspect you'll...
Nothing new that I can offer here except to state what has already been stated in Washington, that it is a...
These briefings were quickly labeled by the cynical press corps as the 5 o'clock follies.
Mr. Freed's question is, how would I characterize the success of the bombings so far? I wouldn't take it as far as to characterize it, Joe.
The 5 o'clock follies in Vietnam dealt in things like body count. It was an effort to show we were winning, that we had the upper hand, that the Viet Cong was defeated and in retreat. And of course, this manifestly was not true.
The man who lied to you publicly at 5 o'clock would level with you over dinner at 7:30. It was a kind of game, a bizarre dance that you went through.
My first reaction, quite honestly, was this is a young bunch of reporters who don't understand war reporting at all. They are trying to show off to each other how tough they can be with the briefing officers. That was my first reaction. Then, as I was there longer, as I myself got out and saw the action and then went to the Follies, I realized how absolutely distinct was the Army version of what happened as opposed to what I had seen happen and what our guys were seeing happen all the time. So I understood that this was not simply a freshman show-off performance, but an actual anger.
We gotta get out of this place.
For all the optimism of the 5 o'clock Follies, it was only a matter of time before the triumphant Viet Cong marched into Saigon.
There's a better life for me and you.
As the humiliated Americans withdrew home in 1975, many in the military cast around to see who else could be blamed.
A very large body of American military opinion that was of field grade rank in Vietnam, who believed at the end of Vietnam that the American press had lost the war for the United States in Vietnam. And while that is not reflected in any of the official histories of any of the armed services, by the time Panama and Grenada and subsequently Iraq came along, many of those field grade officers and the military establishment had decided that it would be a better thing if they locked the press out during combat.
Good evening. Tonight, a naval confrontation between Britain and Argentina looms in the southern Atlantic.
It was to be the British who would first translate the so-called lessons of Vietnam into practice. 1982, the Falklands War.
God save the Queen.
God save the Queen. The fascist regime. It made you a moron. Potential hate bomb. God save the Queen. She ain't no human being. There is no future in England's
I think almost everybody I spoke to in the early stages of the Falklands talked about Vietnam, and their prejudice was that the Americans had lost Vietnam because of the media, and they weren't going to make the same mistake. That, and of course a British tradition, which is that we were nothing like as open, and never had been, and were never going to be, as the Americans can be about letting the media into their operations.
In the Falklands, you were censored at source. You were not only censored on what you could say, but censored about where you could go. When you're on a British ship, if you're in a British camp, if you're with a British unit, you are a prisoner of them. You can't move without them. You can't transmit any of your material unless they say so.
In those days, they worked on the idea that absolute secrecy was the best possible outcome, and they were only just beginning to get into the idea that there was something called reporting as opposed to propaganda.
You had the minder who went with you everywhere. You first showed your copy to him. He would blue pencil whatever. It would then went to the next senior officer who penciled it. Then it would go to the captain who would pencil it. Then it was transmitted to the MOD who would censor it. Only then was it released. We couldn't argue. I remember once I sent a Marisat signal to London to my editor saying, my copy is being censored. And the censor had taken out the word censored, so all he got was my copy is being. I mean, it was that heavy. And you know, it wasn't until much later that we learnt, and I learnt it from a kind of deep-throat signals officer who was aboard one of the ships. He said that even as they were passing the Scilly Isles on their way to the South Atlantic, and that's only 30 miles from Cornwall, they got a signal from Northwood, Naval Headquarters, saying, and the signal simply said diet, D-I-E-T, diet. And that decoded meant starve the press.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back. Their pilots were unhurt, cheerful, and jubilant.
It became the most famous phrase of the war. Brian Hanrahan, cunningly managed to beat the censor to report that no British planes had been shot down. So how did it come about?
This was the first operation of the war. It was when the first planes took off on a bombing raid from Hermes, and they all came back, and I wanted to write down all 12 planes returned safely, and they said, no, you can't do that because you give away the number of planes. And we had the usual argument. I said, they know. They said, no, they don't. So in the end, I agreed, crossed out the phrase, and in my hurry just wrote count on top of it because I hadn't actually thought of anything else to put in. And then an hour later, after rushing off to the helicopter and getting to the telephone and starting the dispatch, I started to read it, hit this blank bit in my dispatch, all nicely written out except for this one phrase with the word count. So I made up the phrase.
Not only did the British completely restrict what journalists could and could not say about the conduct of the war, they also used their control over the press to spread disinformation.
There was a succession of planted bits of information which they wanted us to transmit, which in fact in post-mortem days we decided was not true. I suppose the most famous one was when they sent a Vulcan bomber all the way from Britain to the Falklands via Ascension to bomb the airfield there. And then we were shown the high-altitude reconnaissance photographs. And there they said, look, there's the runway, and look at this, it's all been smashed to smithereens. And of course, we went out that night. I did, and Brian Hanrahan did. We were both transmitting on World Service that the airfield at Port Stanley had been destroyed by this amazing feat, 15,000 miles of flying and a bomb. Of course, it was nothing of the kind. I mean, most of the bombs missed. One caught the edge of the runway. But there we were, telling the world. The people, of course, who were most unimpressed by it were the Argentinians, who knew perfectly well that it hadn't been bombed.
The 29 journalists permitted to travel to the Falklands were all British, and when some American media companies tried to hire their own ship to take their reporters to the conflict zone, the British government said they could be blown out of the water. Those journalists who did get there often found themselves at odds with their military hosts.
It was sometimes thought after the Falklands that I was the Army's favourite journalist. This was a million miles from the truth. For an awful lot of soldiers and officers, I was their most unfavourite journalist because I wanted to go my own way and do my own thing. And they wanted me to stay where I was told. And I've often seen on battlefields senior soldiers visibly contemptuous of the behaviour of journalists because we seem to lack the self-discipline, the sacrifice, the unselfishness, which are absolutely vital if you're going to win wars. We display an egotism, a lust for glory, a selfishness, which is anathema to most soldiers. And after I walked into Port Stanley at the end of the Falklands War, the commanding officer of 2 Paras said he would never take me on operation again because he thought my behaviour was so reckless. He said, I don't care if you get killed, but you could have got good people killed if they had to come and bail you out if the Argentinians had shot you as you deserved.
From a military and political perspective, the totally restricted access and tight censorship made the Falklands conflict a nearly ideal model for the military. In the next war involving America, and the 2 more following that, the Pentagon was to exert even tighter control as they tried to shut reporters out completely.
The assault on Grenada came just before dawn. Fierce fighting was reported, and a US helicopter gunship was shot down and crashed into the sea.
When America went to war for the first time after Vietnam in 1983, there was to be no question of allowing journalists the freedom they had enjoyed during the Vietnam years.
A Marine helicopter force left Barbados heading for Grenada.
The nearest reporters could get to the action was the neighboring island of Barbados.
Completely locked out of Grenada, completely locked out of Panama, Gulf War I, an even more complete lockout.
This is war as many generals and politicians want the world to see it. Cool, clinical, and not a dead body in sight. War I, 1991. Over 1,600 journalists and support crew were sent to cover the conflict. 400 were selected to get close to the action, but the military offered them just one way to cover the war. They had to join news pools in the desert whose movements were controlled by 150 military public affairs officers. And when the action finally started, the minders ensured the correspondents were kept as far from the battlefield as possible.
There was not a single reporter permitted, along with the troops, as they moved forward toward Baghdad finally. We were shut out again. Almost an unconstitutional thing. The whole idea of freedom of speech and press in our Constitution is that the government will certainly be open to the people. In this case, here is the most important thing that a government can do, is commit its young people to combat against now an enemy nation. And we did not have a reporter there. They did assign a couple of so-called pool reporters and cameramen, and then didn't let them go along anyway. It was ridiculous.
As an editor, I got one thing wrong with our coverage of the first Gulf War, and that is, I argued that it was not realistic to believe that journalists could just be allowed to roam all over the battlefield doing their own thing, that there must be a bargain between the authorities and the media to have journalists accredited to specific units and to accept that kind of deal in order to get the sort of information we wanted. Well, I was wrong about that, because in the event, the journalists who were accredited were not allowed to get anywhere near the fighting. And the lesson we learnt from that one is that you couldn't trust the government to keep their side of the bargain. And this, of course, is part of the wider equation. I support the principle that governments do have a right to conceal military information from the public if it's likely to cost people's lives to publicise it. On the other hand, I don't think I've ever known a government which has resisted the temptation to go beyond that and use censorship not merely to conceal vital military information, but just conceal information which happens to be a bit embarrassing politically to them.
For all the appearance of openness and honesty, journalists could not entirely trust the information they were given.
As a measure of effectiveness of how we're doing in the air campaign, I just pull these two things out. I've laundered them so you can't really tell what I'm talking about, because I don't want the Iraqis to know what I'm talking about. But trust me, trust me.
The Allies knew that in the new world of 24 hours a day satellite news, the media could be a useful weapon to confuse and misdirect the enemy.
And the war is not over yet.
I was in one of the lead ships, HMS Gloucester, which was the forward air control ship. And behind us was one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. It had 3,000 Marines on board, and it had coastal landing equipment. And I didn't think we'd be allowed to report it, but we were freely allowed to report the fact that with us was this enormous aircraft carrier carrying invasion troops. 3,000 Marines.
The sudden arrival here of this battle group with such enormous firepower and so close to the coast is something the Iraqis could never have expected. It opens up a second front from the sea and ties down many thousands of Iraqi troops that are now desperately needed.
But of course, there was no intention ever to land these troops on the coast of Iraq or Kuwait. But it kept an awful lot of Iraqi soldiers on that coast. Saddam had to keep them there because he kept hearing through our reports that there was going to be a seaborne invasion.
Their whole objective of the military in 1990 was to keep us away from the war. We took a trip, cameraman Sanan and myself, up to Kafji, up the coast from Dahwan, where we were staying, and found, 2 days after the war began, that the oil refinery there was on fire. It had been shelled by the Iraqis. The Saudi troops had all fled, and the U.S. Marines there were under heavy fire.
Bob Simon in Saudi Arabia begins our coverage. Bob?
Saddam Hussein has long promised an unstoppable inferno of oil. Today, he gave a hint of what it could be like. The Iraqi gunners...
After they filed their oil refinery story, Bob Simon and his team went out looking for more action.
We decided a couple of days later to take a look at another part of the border.
When Kuwait?
Kuwait. The few Saudis who were there said the nearest Iraqis are 5 kilometers away. So we just walked into this no man's land to be able to say, well, here we are reporting from the no man's land, which is something I'm not proud of. And that's when an Iraqi jeep came screaming up to us, and the rest was not history, but misery for the next 40 days.
CBS News said today it will try to send a representative to Baghdad to press the search for 4 missing CBS newsmen.
Oh, who knows, after a minute maximum, that I feel a hand the back of my neck and a barrel of a gun in my stomach, and we're being led away to the car. But like anything else, the power of denial is enormous. And my first thoughts in the car were, hey, I've got a story to file. It's back that way. We're going the wrong way.
Baghdad radio said today the 4 were seized in northern Saudi Arabia because they had entered the area illegally.
Several of the officers had been to the States. And so many Iraqis had studied in the States. And they were very nice with us, and we started talking about American music and American sports and this and that. And then, without any notice, they started beating the shit out of us. And that's when we realized that this wasn't going to be no picnic, and that we weren't talking our way out of this. And this road we were on was getting bombed. Our hands were handcuffed behind our backs, and they were very, very tight. And it was very painful. I complained once early in the trip. I said, please loosen the handcuffs, they're too tight, and the guy made them tighter. They kept on saying they were going to take us to television, that they were going to put us on Iraqi television. And we thought that would be fun. We liked that idea because what was torturing us more than anything else was the notion that nobody would have heard a thing, that, our families probably thought we were dead.
40 days after their capture, thanks to massive international representations on their behalf, Bob Simon and his team were released.
This is a story that could have ended another way, but it's had a happy ending. Look, we're going home, which is the place you go to after a war when, if you've been as lucky as we've been.
Holy cow. That was a large airburst that we saw.
Sometimes, it would seem, the military tries to use journalists for information, albeit with mixed success. CNN's Bernard Shaw had been one of a small group of correspondents who reported the start of the First Gulf War from Saddam's capital, Baghdad. 2 days later, he had made his exit to neighboring neutral Jordan, where he was met by an unexpected visitor.
Before I could reach for the phone to call my wife to tell her that I was safely in Amman, the bureau chief there said, "Bernie, that man over there has been waiting for you for 4 hours. He's a spook." He was a United States Army intelligence officer, a major, wearing civilian clothing. He said, "Mr. Shaw, I would like to talk to you, and I'd like to know some of the things you've seen and heard over the past few days." And I said, "Major, I don't want to offend you, but I have nothing to say to you." I said, "I am not a combatant, I'm a journalist." He said, "Well, if Ted Turner told you to talk to me, then it might be different." I said, "Major, even if my boss, Ted Turner, ordered me to talk to you, I still would not talk to you." We just arrived in Amman after... I reported that in a news conference with about 125 reporters. And the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, all the wire services moved stories about that revelation. And I was intensely attacked by a lot of conservative people in the United States, among them Charlton Heston. I remember Heston saying, "Who does Bernie Shaw think he is, Switzerland?"
In spite of Bernie Shaw's neutrality, the Allies secured a lightning victory in the First Gulf War. It was to be the last time that the media could be so tightly controlled. This is the newsroom of a new force in 21st century media.
Fade sound makes a cue.
Al Jazeera satellite television. For the first time, Western news organizations and Arab state-controlled television have a rival that challenges their view of world events with uncensored images from an Arab perspective. They are also a favorite means for Osama bin Laden to issue statements.
You have to remember, we are a new phenomenon, media phenomenon in the Arab world. Until we came to be, that was back in November of '96. Pan-Arab media in general was, to a large extent, subservient to authority. In other words, under the control of the censor. However, when Al Jazeera came, people all of a sudden were exposed to the other point of view.
Al Jazeera's other point of view includes the showing of images regarded as completely unacceptable in Western media.
Unfortunately, war is not clean. War creates carnage, death. Innocent people are caught in the crossfire. We cannot deny that. Anybody who denies that, I don't think, is living on Mars or something. So I think we would be deceiving our audience if we were to ignore these aspects of the war. If we were to ignore them, I think it's only then that we would be editorializing our content, because we would be going along blindly with assertions and statements that are not true.
In spite of accusations against it in the West of being partisan, Al Jazeera claims to be equally disliked by both sides.
The Iraqi regime and the coalition forces, they could agree on nothing except disliking Al Jazeera's editorial line. We have been not only hassled by the Americans and the British, our people were intimidated by the Iraqis authorities. When they rolled into Baghdad, there were death threats, arrests, being manhandled by the Iraqis. Some of our reporters were threatened with their limbs being severed, tongues cut.
When planning this war, in the age of satellite television and 24-hour news, the coalition recognized that a media strategy based on shutting reporters out from the action was bound to fail.
Interestingly, the military now place more emphasis on what they call the total information war than they ever did before. It is important to them to win the hearts and minds back home, to be seen to be winning the war. The war is not won until that statue is toppled. How do you see the statue is toppled? You see it on television. Therefore, television is terribly important to them. It's also how generals communicate with their most important constituency, which is the families of the soldiers fighting under them.
They're calling it Route Hurricane through the southern Iraqi desert because obviously this is a very fast-moving force by traditional military standards, but it's still a long train, if you will, a long convoy.
This was to be the coalition's showpiece news strategy.
Side of this berm, we don't know what started it.
More than 700 reporters sleeping, traveling, and sharing with units of the military.
It's mission accomplished.
I think what the embedded reporters showed us is when we take a deliberate approach and say we're going to partner you with some organization, a unit, a squadron that's aboard a ship, whatever it happens to be, and that there are certain rules we want you to live by. We're going to give you extraordinary access. You're going to see things, some of which will even be classified, that are projected operations. And we would ask you to live by these rules. And we base the encounter thereafter on trust. That's a new dynamic. Trust is a different form of control. It is control nevertheless, but it's shared control. There's a high degree of control.
In spite of the control, many in the media establishment, like the military, regarded embedding as a great success. The other arm of the coalition's information strategy took the form of daily briefings, usually held by General Vincent Brooks in a specially constructed set in a warehouse in Qatar.
I think we have to all recognize that in the globalized environment that I talked about earlier, that there are a number of consumers to every piece of information, whether it's something that's posted on the internet, something that's in a newspaper, or something we broadcast. And given that recognition, which I certainly had in mind with each day that I had that mission, we should also consider what important messages need to be conveyed to whatever consumers might be out there.
It is a known residence that is used by Saddam Hussein and his sons.
For all its dedication to truth, there were those in the media audience at the daily briefings at CENTCOM headquarters in Qatar who questioned the value of the exercise, one that they likened to the 5 o'clock follies of the Vietnam War.
I'm Michael Wolf from New York Magazine, and I want to ask about the value proposition of these briefings. We're no longer being briefed by senior-most officers. To the extent that we get information, it's largely information already released by the Pentagon. What's the value to us for what we learn at this $1 million press center?
I've gotten applause already. That's wonderful. I appreciate that.
There will always be opinions as to what the value was. And I think that some of the feedback I've gotten from a very consistent number of corners do not square with that particular opinion, that it was a waste of time. I know that my responsibility was to try to articulate what was going on in the operation, keep things in context, be truthful about exactly what was going on, and at the same time recognize the nature of the global environment we were operating in.
Okay, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
The boy's life is slipping away as we watch.
Sarajevo is a formal town, so we thought a navy blue vest. Garden. Many landscapes in a tiny land.
When they are not fighting the army or the politicians for access, for information, for truth, television war reporters have yet another hurdle to overcome: their own bosses at home.
You talk about censorship and editorial control. I bet every war correspondent, television guy you talk to moans about the fact that real war has never been shown on television and never will be.
The Good Taste Brigade have got serious, and it is very difficult now to report the reality of war. This is an argument I had uphill and down dale for many years. What you show are almost heroic figures in uniform blazing away with their Kalashnikovs or whatever they've got, and their big artillery, and it's all very spectacular, especially the naval video is highly spectacular. What you don't really see is what happens at the other end. You can see big explosions. You don't see the maiming of civilians. You don't see the killing of civilians. You don't even see the wounding or the killing of soldiers very much. You get the impression it's highly spectacular, like a grand video game, and that war is a cost-free way of settling differences. This is terribly dangerous and fundamentally untrue.
I think that those of us in recent wars who've worked on the home front, so to speak, as editors, are much more aware, maybe not necessarily more sensitive, but much more aware of the pressure of public opinion, the notions of taste, which, by the way, differ quite dramatically, and that debate is important to listen to about what actually is palatable to the audience.
I think that probably one of the last great taboos in television now is death. Arguments about moment of death are quite extraordinary. I've known 2 instances myself where we've had phone calls from editors in London who've said, was that person actually dead when you filmed them, or were they still alive? And you say, you can't tell? And they say, no. And you say, so what does it matter? And they say, oh, it does matter. It does matter. You see, if they were still just, alive, it'd be all right.
Well, I certainly give the graphic imagery. I certainly do. I remember after the 1991 Gulf War, I was on the road north to Basra. And at one point, I was with an ITV crew, and on the right-hand side of the road were a group of Iraqi soldiers dead. And wild dogs had come in across the sand over the desert and were tearing them to pieces for food, running off with someone's arm between their teeth, the fingers dragging through the sand, ripping out stomachs to eat. Verminous dogs. And I saw the ITV crew filming this, and I said, you'll never get that on the air. He said, no, I know, it's just for the archives. But you see, it should be on the air. And the reason the authorities in television, the reason governments think, oh, you can't, but this is obscene, we must respect the dead. We don't want to respect the dead, we kill them. What we want to do is to stop people seeing these images, because if they saw them, they would never, ever again support war. And we want a population that will, when we want, support wars.
When we left for the Falklands, leaving Portsmouth and Southampton, I was aboard Hermes, and there was this forest of Union Jacks. There was the brass band playing. There were women taking off their bras and throwing them to their boyfriends aboard the ships. Great, wonderful. But you know, what they weren't prepared for was the consequence when the body bags came back, when the coffins were flown in. You know, they didn't want to see how these men that they were cheering on died, because you know, when you die, you don't fall over backwards with a gasp. Shrapnel blows you apart. A mortar can do enormous damage to the human body, but that's never allowed to be seen. And I think that's almost a war crime, because it does make sending people to war an acceptable thing to do.